Here we are back in a summer of Psalms, or a Psalms of summer, whichever you prefer. And we've been just flying through the Psalms this summer, looking almost exclusively at the lesser known Psalms. We've been doing a bypass on Psalm 23 and on Psalm 100 and several other well-known Psalms, looking at the less well-known. And today we're going to do one of each. One hardly known at all, one very well known. We'll start with the unknown. Psalm 89 is a psalm that was written by Ethan, the Ezrahite, it says. 1 Chronicles chapter 16 lists a Jeduthun, just a J added to it, as one of David's royal singers. So we think it's likely that this Ethan was Jeduthun mentioned in 1 Chronicles 16. One day David looks out his window from his palace and he sees the tent that occupies the ark of God. And it troubles him greatly. He's living in this beautiful palace while the presence of God rests in a tent, the equivalent of a pop-up camper. And David decides he wants to build a house for God. He wants to build a magnificent temple for God. But God tells David, no, you've got too much blood on your hands. There's been too much sin in your life. Solomon, your son, will be the one that builds the great temple, thus known as Solomon's temple. But then he says, as a consolation, David, you will build for me a house, a dynasty that will last forever, an enduring successor, an everlasting throne, and an eternal kingdom will come from that dynasty I'm going to allow you to build. And Ethan sings of that dynasty throughout Psalm 89. Not too long ago, I read a post on Facebook that was both insightful and revealing to me. It said, beware of destination addiction. I'd never heard the term, so I paused and took a picture of it. Destination addiction is a preoccupation with the idea that happiness is in the next place, the next job, and with the next partner. Until you give up that idea that happiness is somewhere else, it will never be where you are. I think that's so true. And the psalm writer's insight is going to pinpoint this never-ending chase for happiness that so many people strive for from day to day. It also will reveal an honest admission of what drives so many people to overeat, overdrink, overmedicate, even at the cost of family and health and reputation and sometimes freedom and sometimes even life itself. Happiness, understood from a biblical perspective, is God's desire for all of us. You remember whenever you've been taught, hopefully, about the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, that when we learned them in King James and New King James versions growing up, it was, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in heart, blessed are the poor in spirit, but the word literally means happy. And that's true in both the Old and New Testament. The words are used interchangeably. Both the Hebrew and Greek words for blessed in the Old and New Testament means happy. So, we can conclude from that one of the marks of holy people, of godly people, is that they should be people who are happy. Now, in this song from Ethan, the Ezrahite, we learn some key reasons why we should be happy. regardless of what our circumstances are. And it starts with one verse that is well known. Unknown psalm, known verse. Psalm 89:1 says, I will sing of the Lord's unfailing love forever. Young and old will hear of your faithfulness. And one of the first big explosive hits in contemporary Christian worship was made out of this verse. I will sing of the Lord's love forever. And that's 30, 40 years ago. And since then, it has also become a hymn in churches. It's moved from a contemporary Christian song to a hymn in churches, but it's based directly on the words of this psalm. I will sing of the unfailing love of the Lord forever. And then he says, your unfailing love will last forever. Your faithfulness is as enduring as the heavens. And I'll just pop in verse 15 since it's the same theme. Happy are those who hear the joyful call to worship, for they will walk in the light of your presence, O Lord. There is a joy and a happiness to be found in worship that is simply unmatched. I've been amazed over the last 20 years at some of the worship wars in some of our churches, and I think they're mostly due to simple ignorance about who worship is really for. Who worship is really for. I had a friend in Nashville one time that visited a church near his home, but he realized he just did not like their style of worship at all, and he loved the minister's sermon, and he thought he might be open to advice on how they might improve their worship. And so he approached the preacher and said that he thought maybe if they changed the music a little bit and changed the format a little bit, the church might be even better. And the preacher asked him, what was it you thought the Lord didn't like? And he said, I didn't have an answer ready for that question. And so he said, I realized for the first time that worship isn't about me, it's about praising the Lord. And he decided then the only thing about it that God didn't like was his own critical spirit. And I think he was probably right. Real worship occurs when we focus on God and not merely on our own personal preferences. And if worship is going to be a source for our happiness, as this psalm teaches, then our worship must be true. And I think we sometimes malign the focus of our worship with two false beliefs. The first is the belief that the aim of worship is to inspire us. For many, worship is about what tantalizes them or gives them a chill running up and down their spine, rather than what teaches them or what trains them. But the psalmist says, we learn to worship God, and inspiration is not the focus. Personal inspiration is not the focus of why we do that. It is the byproduct of why we do that. Worship primarily is not for us. We get the byproduct benefit of it making us happy or blessed, but worship is for God. You never see the angels in heaven when they were worshiping God going, man, this is making us feel better. No, that wasn't the point. The point is to worship the Almighty God. And the second false belief is that the purpose for worship is to repay. We're repaying God part of what we owe him. Well, we can't possibly repay God anything that we owe him, and particularly not in 1 hour a week in church singing. Have you heard you sing? I was just kidding there. The purpose for worship is to align us with the truth. That when we realize the great gap that lies between us and God because of our sin, when we see the tremendous work that God did to bridge that gap, we will be able to experience happiness and joy when we are in communion with God and God's family in worship. The French have a proverb that provides insight here, I think, for worship. A good meal ought to begin with hunger. It's hard to enjoy a meal when you're not hungry. But when you're starving, anything tastes good. Same thing is true with worship. We come here on Sunday or on Wednesday. Our hearts should be thirsty and hungry for God. There's the song we always sing based on Psalm 42, as a deer pants for water, so my heart pants for thee. We're so thirsty for God. There's a text in the Sermon on the Mount in the Beatitudes where God says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. When we come here hungry, we'll get fed. When we come here thirsty, we'll have plenty to drink. As we approach worship with a hunger to meet God, we'll be filled. When we come preoccupied or filled with our own problems or self-sufficiencies, we don't experience meaningful worship. Verse 15 we read a few moments ago said, walking with the Lord is what brings us happiness. Its New Testament cousin passage is in 1 John chapter 1. It says, if we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. Would you read verse 7 aloud with me, please, everyone? But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, purifies us from all sins. There's nothing like walking in the light. Down here in South Florida, especially in the winter, I don't know about the summer walking in the light very much, but especially in the winter, I sometimes like to get my bike out and go through my whole neighborhood. Or I sometimes like to just take a walk on a day when it is not too hot or too cold. And there's very little that brings more happiness than walking in the sunshine of God's presence any time of the day. These scriptures knew exactly what they were saying. Being happy when our lives are warm and sunny is far easier than being happy when our lives are dealt with traumatic circumstances. But if we're walking with God and aware of his presence, it is always possible, no matter what happens to us. This young lady is an excellent example of that. Her name is Bethany Hamilton. How many of you know her story or know anything about her? About half of you. She learned to surf when she was a preschooler. And from her first surfing competition at age 8, she was a rising athlete. But then at the age of 13, she was attacked by a shark, which tragically tore away her left arm. Her life was made into a best-selling biography and a feature film about a dozen years ago. And you say, where is the happiness in this story? Well, she was a believer, gave her heart to the Lord as a young lady. And in the years since, it has only strengthened her. Her accident has only strengthened her in her walk with God. And as she was being rushed to the hospital on the day of her attack, she said, and I quote, being able to turn to Jesus in this crazy moment in my life gave me a sense of peace and calmness. And I think that's the one thing that just kept me alive. She recovered to become a world-class surfer again with one arm. She still sees the ocean as a gift from God and her happy place, her chance to walk in the light of his presence. Phenomenal story. Terrible circumstance. Happens in your happy place, the one place where you excel and that you love. You lose your arm. You think you're losing your life. You're probably losing the career and your love of your life. And you go right back there. And it's because God gave you the strength to do it as you walked with God. So in the middle part of chapter 89, the psalmist continues, they rejoice all day long in your wonderful reputation. They exult in your righteousness. You are their glorious strength. It pleases you to make us strong. Yes, our protection comes from the Lord, and he, the Holy One of Israel, has given us our King. So what happens here in this chapter is that God's name is used multiple times and in different ways, and it is a different name for God that is used throughout the chapter. God's names represent his character. And so because of who he is, it tells us something about what he does. And so in this particular instance, in this chapter, he's going to use the term Elohim, which means God is the creator. He is going to use the term Adonai, Lord, which means God is master. He is going to use the term Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. He's going to use the term Jehovah Shalom, which means the Lord is peace. All of God's names tell us something different about God himself. And that's something that we can rejoice greatly in, that we have a God who has takes so many names to describe all the good things he can do for us. I've said many times, my opinion, the greatest book of the 20th century was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Not just my opinion. It was voted the best Christian book of the 20th century. And Lewis wrote something apropos here in that book. When Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could be like gods, could set up on their own as if they had created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, slavery, the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. And then he concludes those thoughts by saying, God cannot give us a happiness and peace apart from himself because it is not there. Only if people could find that. And so that's exactly what Psalm 89 is describing, how to find happiness in the Lord. And so he moves on and says, one of the ways you do this is by realizing you are their glorious strength. It pleases you to make us strong. Yes, our protection comes from the Lord, and he, the Holy One of Israel, has given us our King. He is our shield when we are worried. He is our glory when we feel worthless. He is, as we sometimes sing in our assembly, our all in all. If we're ever going to be happy, we must build our true identity on the way God sees us, not on the things we do to pursue the passions we enjoy. How we see ourselves, listen, this is very important. How we see ourselves, I am convinced, is way different from how God sees us. We like to see ourselves as dust. God views us as his birthed children. If you are a Christian, you are his birthed child. And so I ask those of you who have children or grandchildren to think of God looking at you the way you look at your children or grandchildren, except he has the ability to do it in an absolutely perfect way. Wow. And that's the way God sees us. He looks at us through the righteousness of Christ and through the work of the cross and calls us loved. And as this text in Psalm 89 has said, he is your constant presence, your constant provider, your constant protection. And because of that, with God, you can always be happy. And if you ever get unhappy, just remind yourself of that. Whatever it takes to remind you of those great truths. Judithan, who wrote this, would say, do it. Psalm 90 is completely different from Psalm 89. Psalm 90 is attributed to Moses. It was probably written shortly before his death, near the end of Israel's 40 years in the desert. That would make it the oldest of the Psalms. It's almost certainly the oldest of the Psalms. In fact, next to Job, Psalm 90 is probably the oldest passage in all the Bible. That's what makes it unique. And it begins in a unique place as well by saying, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Now let's pull over there and park a minute, because I want to explain to you what the Hebrew ear heard when he said our dwelling place. The word dwelling place could be translated in real language to the Hebrews as den. Den, D-E-N. God, you have been our den. Now, what's the difference between a den and a living room? Well, I can tell you what it was in my house growing up for sure. My mom did not want my brother and I scuffling in the living room. If I had friends over, we could not wrestle, we could not scuffle in the living room. We had friends over, she would shut the doors to the living room off, and it was off limits to us, but in the den, we could beat the snot out of each other. She didn't care. That was the comfortable place, was in the den. That's where everyday life took place. The living room, I don't know how many of you had, sometimes she actually had covers, plastic covers over the furniture in the living room. Do any of you know what I'm talking about? Your mama did that too? We had a bunch of whacked out mamas, didn't we? So you couldn't have fun in the living room, but in the den, anything goes. A den is where you relax. It's where you be yourself. You let your hair down. It's the cozy place. God wants us to relax and be ourselves in His presence. We don't have to come up with some kind of fancy, to me, there's nothing worse than people who change their vocabulary when they're talking to God. We don't have to come up with some kind of fancy language or anything else to try to impress God. Doesn't impress Him. Just be yourself with God is what He wants. You have been our dwelling place, our den, our cozy place. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now, there's a lot of profound truth right there. Before the mountains were born, before you brought forth the whole world, that means He had no beginning. To everlasting, that means He has no end. The Hebrew word everlasting means vanishing point. God is beyond the vanishing point. Think back as far as you can, 1 million years, 10 million years, however long you want to try to think back, God is there. Think ahead until the timeline fades in the distance, God is there. He has no beginning, He has no end. The Christian theologian Augustine was the first person credited with thinking of eternity not just as infinite time, but as a place completely outside of time. This is important. Try to grasp this in your mind. Augustine reasoned that time was an entity created with the rest of creation. Time started being dated on the fifth day or fourth day when God made the sun and the moon, and it started being dated. An entity created at creation, but eternity is outside of time. So God is not apart from time, but separate from time. Interestingly enough, modern physics and Einstein's theory of relativity have validated Augustine, but his conclusions were drawn from the scriptures. That's where his conclusions came from. When he said, how can the past and future be when the past no longer is and the future is not yet? As for the present, if it were always present and never moved on to become the past, it would not be time, but eternity, outside of time. Christianity is the only religion that ever spawns serious scientific inquiry. Animism taught an enchanted world, rivers and rocks that were inhabited by spirits that controlled everything. Nature was ruled by goons and gremlins. Then the polytheistic religions came along with their pantheon of gods. That was what was available in the first century when Jesus walked the earth. And storm and lightning bolts were attributed to the whims of God. And so you had this pantheon of gods, and the Romans were just fine to put Jesus up on the shelf with their pantheon of gods. But he is God alone. Only Christianity postulated an ordered universe with predictable laws subject to reason and examination. Often today, you'll hear people try to pit Christianity and science against each other. That could not be further from the truth. The Bible is not a science book, but it also doesn't shy from some scientific information. In fact, pre-scientific information, a lot of it, actually, if we had the time to go through it. Beginning in verse 3, we read, "You turn people back to dust, saying, 'Return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in a night.'" Apparently, a timeless God that exists outside of time, like we talked about with Augustine, views time much differently than we do. His perspective is not our own. 1,000 years like a day to him. So, I want to ask you to this. Think back 1,000 years. What were you doing? No, I'm kidding. Because I know somebody's liable to stay up and say, well, I was a toad in Venezuela, you know. What do you know about 1,000 years ago? Well, and this was like a day ago to God, okay? The first crusade was launched 1,000 years ago. The feudal system was at its zenith. The Chinese invented gunpowder for the first time. 1000 AD was 300 years before the compass was invented. It was 400 years before the printing press was invented. It was 500 years before Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Think of all the advancements and rulers and discoveries. So much has happened, and yet to God, it's like a day ago. It's like it was Saturday. That's when you know you're really big. That's when you know you're really outside the realm of time and also what we can really understand. No wonder our impatience has so little effect on God. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass, and we, as we sing in that old hymn, fly away. We fly away. Now I want you to understand, this was written by Moses somewhere around 1445 BC, before Christ. And Moses expected that the average person would live to 70 and maybe to 80 if their strength endures. 1,500 years ago, when the lifespan was more like in 20s and 30s, due to childhood diseases and wars and viruses for which there were no antibiotics. And he said that. And guess what? Today, the average American lifespan is 75 for men and 79 for women. It's a surprise that 3,500 years of medicine in between the time when he said this has brought us an extra year or two. But still, compared to eternity, our life is just like a puff of breath in the morning air. So teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Several years ago, the oldest person on earth was a woman in Arles, France named Jeannie Clement. That's her. On her she was the oldest person in the world recorded. On her 120th birthday, somebody asked her, "What kind of future do you expect?" And she said, "A short one." And she spoke for us all, really, because we all, even if our strength endures, have a short one. And then we fly away, as we sometimes sing, "I'll fly away." Another older lady was asked about her plans for the future, and she said, "Honey, at my age, I don't even buy green bananas." I get that. But while we're still here, here's what we should do according to the New Testament. "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time." We got to take care of our time. Got to use our days wisely. Ben Franklin said, "Dost thou love life? Then do not squander time, for that is the stuff life is made of." As the poet puts it, only one life will soon be past. Only what's done for God will last. And Psalm 90 clearly reminds us of that. I don't know if anybody's been to this home. It's the Fairbanks house in Dedham, Massachusetts. Has anybody been there? Raise your hand if you have. Well, we should get up a trip. It's the oldest home in America. It was built somewhere between 1637 and 1641 for Puritan immigrants. Jonathan and Grace Fairbanks and their 6 children then passed down the home for several generations until the final family member actually moved out in 1904. So for 270 years, the house was home to the same named family and is now a museum. Wouldn't it be great to pass your family along a home like that for 270 years? To Moses, a house like this would have felt like a dream. There would have been no desert wondering if he had a home to go back to. Instead, he claims God is his home. "You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance." God is his home. Though the people of Israel had neither a cot nor a cottage, they could always run to the eternal shelter of God. A God of eternity who knows no limitations or time and space, as we just studied today. Late or early, not in his vocabulary. Someday, somebody else will live in the home you dwell in today, just like The Dedhams kept that home for 270 years. I still can't believe that, but now other people visit it. And someday somebody will live in the home that you actually live in now, but God's home is ours to live in forever and all eternity. Isn't that a great thought? And Moses had this same sense when he said, "You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in light of your countenance." You see, what we do in the night, God sees in the light. What we try to hide on the back page of our life, God headlines on the front page. When we try to write in fine print, God posts it in bold. He sees both our external acts and our internal thoughts and motives. And from the first day of our lives to the last, his paternal view over us as his child never dims. And here's the good news, and this is really good news. The good news is God loves us enough to get righteously angry and want to correct us when we fall into sin. If he didn't care, he wouldn't. The next time you think you may be experiencing God's discipline in your life in one way or another, you ought to rejoice. Because without that discipline, you may continue on a path carrying you away from God, but with that discipline, he is trying to draw you back in because he loves you in the same way that you love your children or grandchildren and discipline them. And we can be thankful to live under the perspective of such a loving Father. Moses wrote, "Who can comprehend the power of your anger? Your wrath is as awesome as the fear you deserve." And so he said, "Satisfy us each morning with your unfailing love, so we may sing for joy to the end of our lives." Don't we fill our lives with things that will never satisfy us? I know I do. Moses doesn't ask to be satisfied by pleasure or power or possessions. Instead, he desires to be satisfied with God's undeniable, unconditional, unfailing love. His love is not fickle like a game of he loves me not, he loves me not. He stays on one theme, he loves me. It's unconditional and unfailing. 5 words I guarantee you will never, ever hear from God. I don't love you anymore. Not going to happen. You are unique. There is not, has never been, nor ever will be anyone just like you. No 2 fingerprints are alike. No 2 DNAs are alike. And so, let us give gladness in proportion to our former misery. Replace the evil years with good. Let us, your servants, see your work again. Let our children see your glory. And may the Lord our God show us his approval and make our efforts successful. Yes, make our efforts successful. A thrilling ending to a unique chapter, maybe the oldest chapter in the Bible, certainly some of the oldest words written in the Bible.